War finally came at 11 a.m. on Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939. Only a year after securing peace in our time at Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was forced to bring the nation the news it had been dreading. Britain was once again at war with Germany.
I was frightened, not knowing quite what to expect, really.
It was quite a traumatic time, but there are many, many instances in war where one feels, well, if your number's up, you get in. We had many, many escapes.
We were all pretty well terrified.
Only 25 minutes after war...
Almost immediately after the announcement of war, air raid warning sirens blared out over London. It seemed as if Hitler's bombers would arrive any minute.
We'd had a pretty good demonstration of what their German Air Force could do in the Spanish Civil War, that the alarm bells began to ring in this country.
3rd of September, war was declared, and we went in the garden and put on our gas masks and just didn't know quite what was going to happen next.
Men and women in the streets made their way quickly to the nearest shelter and queued up in orderly processions at the entrances.
First warning, we all took shelter, and some of the elderly people come down with their gas masks on, you see.
Although the alarm proved to be a false one, it was of great benefit as a full-dress rehearsal and a swift reminder of what war now means to the civilian.
And yet the weeks and months that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. It was to be some time before either side committed to a major attack or there was any fighting on the ground. It was a period of uncertainty and of doubt. People simply carried on with their daily lives and waited for something to happen. It became known as the Phoney War.
We never knew that the Germans may not be sending their Air Force over to raid us the very next day.
It was a very weird time because, you know, you still half expected all sorts of awful things to happen. They were always in the back of your mind.
It was just on 12 months before the first of the German raiders came over this country. And so we were given that period, which the Americans christened the Phoney War, because there was no action taking place.
It was a strange period, the Phoney War.
It was, you know, sort of living on a knife edge, really, wondering what was going to happen next.
The British Expeditionary Force has taken its place beside the armies of France to confront the German military machine. Neither of these two arms of our defence has yet been seriously engaged.
During the late summer and autumn months of 1939, the British people steeled themselves for the coming struggle, helped by their government, which did its best to prepare the population for what might lie ahead. The problem was that no one could be absolutely sure what Nazi Germany had planned for Britain, and no idea as to when the inevitable attacks would come. There was one weapon that the government seemed certain the Germans would use, and that was poison gas. And so they set about issuing the civilian population with gas masks.
Well, I just remember mine. I don't remember having to put it on other than the test, but it was the standard Mickey Mouse gas mask, a little red thing, and we were tested for them. And we never liked wearing them, of course, but they were restricted.
Pretty awful, because it was this sort of box, like a cardboard box, that we had to carry around, and it was a bit claustrophobic, you know, not very nice.
There were gas masks for adults and children and gas helmets for babies. Nearly 38 million of these were issued before 1940, and the instruction to people was to carry them at all times.
Millions of gas masks had been...
If you didn't wear your respirator, there was no doubt about it, if there was a gas attack and the gas was coming your way, it would prove fatal and very, very painful.
Although the government threatened to punish those without a gas mask, a survey found that only about 3/4 of the population ever heeded its advice.
I'll never forget the horrible smell of these gas masks, awful rubbery smell, and they really felt when you put them on as if you were suffocating.
Air raid shelters, both public and private, became a part of the landscape. At first, the government was determined not to use tube stations as public bomb shelters, not least because of the threat of disease that might arise through the lack of toilet facilities and the worry that people might use them as permanent bases. But the general public was very keen on them, and popular opinion won through. The tube stations of London became vital shelters during the horrors of the Blitz, which came a year or so later. In the end, 79 stations were fitted with bunks and chemical toilets. 124 canteens were placed throughout the tube system.
Because if you lived in London, most people went to the underground shelters, which my mother did frequently. She had a little bag packed and was ready immediately to dive down into the underground. And I would prefer to get into bed and cover my head up with blankets and hope for the best, because I couldn't bear to go down there. But most people did and would go down there every night.
In gardens and backyards, the Anderson shelter became a fixture. More than 2.25 million were distributed by the government during 1939, free to families earning less than £250 per year, £7 each to those with higher incomes. Made from galvanised corrugated steel panels, Anderson shelters, named after the civil engineer David Anderson, were 6 feet high, 4 feet 6 wide and 6 feet long. There were 14 panels in all. Once the shelter was bolted together and assembled, it was to be buried 4 feet deep in the ground and covered in at least 15 inches of soil on the roof. Although most people did their best to make the shelters as comfortable as possible, they were prone to flooding. However, Anderson's shelters were sturdy and they were robust, and they proved to be effective against anything other than a direct hit during German bombing raids when they eventually came.
And the children use it in normal times as a playshed.
But perhaps nothing sums up the social upheaval of the Phoney War better than the mass evacuation of children away from major cities and into the countryside, which took place during 1939. Even at this distance, it's not hard to imagine the distress of families suddenly split up in this way, or to appreciate the heartache of parents faced with the awful dilemma of wanting to keep their family together, but their children safe. Naturally enough, though, the cinema newsreels were there to paint a positive picture.
The efficiency with which these schemes of evacuation have been planned and executed is a consoling thought and a matter of congratulation to the organizers. The departure of the children, in particular, has been a triumph of orderly precision. From cities and towns, children in their thousands have left their parents behind and been drafted off to safety zones.
The last we saw of our kids, we gave them a last kiss and a hug. And there were lots of tears flowing among the parents and the children. And off went the train, carrying the children into the unknown. And that's the last we saw of them. We went back home and we sat in the empty house looking at each other, wondering if we'd done the right thing.
With food and clothing provided by their parents and each carrying a gas mask, they entrain for their excitingly unknown destination.
I was about 7 years of age at the time. I can remember, going to the mainline station and palling up with a chap who was about 4 years older than I was, a chap called Brian Stringer from Battersea. And I don't think my mother was too pleased at the time, but we actually finished up being billeted together in a farmhouse in Dolphinholme in Lancashire.
How long will they be away?
Obviously it was picked up, I was homesick and I was fretting, even though I was enjoying the farm and I had missed my mother. dreadfully.
Daily lives has been shattered by one man hundreds of miles away in a country they have never seen. That it has been brought about by what Mr. Chamberlain has described as the senseless ambition of this one man.
One organisation that was heavily involved with the evacuations was the Women's Voluntary Service. This was just one way in which women could do their bit, something that was encouraged as part of the all-in-it-together spirit of the times. Even the Queen sent her personal message to Britain's women in the form of a call to duty.
War has at all times called for the fortitude of women. Even in other days, when it was an affair of the fighting forces only, wives and mothers at home suffered constant anxiety for their dear ones, and too often the misery of bereavement. Their lot was all the harder because they felt they could do so little beyond heartening through their own courage and devotion the men at the front. Now this is all changed, for we, no less than men, have real and vital work to do. To us also is given the proud privilege of serving our country in her hour of need.
But despite the preparations and the advice and the official exhortations, everything remained quiet in Britain in the weeks and months after the declaration of war. But the government was determined not to allow the public to be lulled into a false sense of security by the lack of action, and so they released public information films like this one, a gem of its kind, that combined staged reconstructions, a slightly hectoring tone, and large helpings of good old-fashioned common sense.
But don't rush. Take cover quietly, then others will do the same. If you're in the open with no cover, lie down. If your home is within 5 minutes, go there and take shelter. And keep away from windows. Admit passers-by, they need shelter too. Motorists, get off the main road, park close to the curb. Switch off headlamps, leave only side and rear lamps. Always carry your gas mask. See that your blackout is complete. Above all, don't stand staring at the sky. Take cover.
While nothing much was happening in Britain, what was happening in Germany and in the countries she had so ruthlessly occupied? Hitler had committed most of his forces to Poland, but those he hadn't were sent to man the Siegfried Line, a fortified defensive line which ran for almost 400 miles along the border with France. On the other side of the border was the French Maginot Line, their version of the Siegfried Line, a complex system of fortifications and tank defences designed to prevent a German invasion. And there the two sides stood watching each other. All was quiet, save for a few localised skirmishes, so the British, who had joined their French allies, took the opportunity to drop propaganda leaflets on Germany. However, in November 1939, things began to hot up, not in Britain or France, but in Finland. On the last day of that month, the Soviet Union, which had concluded a non-aggression pact with Germany, attacked with more than 1 million troops and 6,500 tanks. Although there had been a long history of mistrust and disagreements between the two countries, the main concerns of the Soviet Union and its leader Joseph Stalin was that Finland would be used as a bridgehead by an enemy in order to attack Leningrad. So he decided to do something about it. The Finns were completely outnumbered. There were 4 times as many Soviet troops as Finnish ones, and 200 times as many tanks. The Finnish Air Force was tiny, just 130 planes, while the skies above Finland were soon filled with nearly 4,000 Soviet aircraft. The Soviets reckoned on a campaign lasting little more than 2 weeks, at the end of which Helsinki would be captured. And yet, despite their huge advantage in numbers, the Soviet invasion didn't go quite as planned. The Finns proved to be a formidable foe. They were tough forest-dwelling soldiers that were used to the bitterly cold winter. Moving swiftly on skis and camouflaged in white, they rarely joined the Soviets in conventional battle, preferring instead to attack isolated units and strike at vital supplies, such as field kitchens. The Soviets certainly came to fear the deadly Finnish snipers. One sniper is said to have made 542 kills, although his targets were easily visible in the white snow with their dark uniforms. Deadly Molotov cocktails, an improvised petrol bomb, were hurled at the Soviet tanks by the Finns. More than 2,000 tanks were lost. There were several reasons why things went so badly at first for the Soviets. The troops were poorly trained and inexperienced. They were taken aback by the level and the ferocity of the Finnish resistance. They were ill-prepared for a savage winter that saw temperatures drop to -40 degrees. And they were badly led by second-rate commanders employing outdated and inflexible battle tactics. After all, most of the competent high-ranking officers had been executed during the recent Stalinist purges. Because of a combination of all these factors, the Finns were able to hang on until March 1940. Perhaps an armistice suited both sides. Although the Soviets had finally brought their vastly superior numbers and resources to bear and gained the upper hand, the army was exhausted and was in grave danger of becoming bogged down in the thick forests. On the other hand, the Finns were rapidly running out of ammunition and could obviously not withstand the Soviets indefinitely. The peace treaty signed on March the 12th assigned 10% of Finnish territory to the Soviets and about a fifth of its industrial capacity. It was not that far short of what Stalin originally wanted. But the victory had been won at quite a cost. 126,000 Soviet troops had been killed or had gone missing during the Finnish campaign. More than 250,000 more had been wounded. 5,000 troops were taken prisoner. The international reputation of the Soviet Union was badly damaged by the whole enterprise. And in Berlin, Adolf Hitler noted the unsure performance of the Red Army in Finland. He decided that the Soviet Red Army was no match for the Wehrmacht, and much later, in 1941, he sent his troops into Russia to prove it. In December 1940, while the Finns and the Soviets were doing battle, the first major naval battle of the Second World War took place. The River Plate estuary off the coast of Argentina and Uruguay was perhaps not the place anyone would have expected the Allied and German navies to first come to blows. But it was here, on December the 13th, that the German heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee opened fire on 3 British ships: HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles. The Admiral Graf Spee had been the scourge of merchant shipping in the South Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean since the outbreak of war in 1939. Many merchant ships had been sunk, although no lives had been lost because her captain, Hans Langsdorff, had a policy of taking enemy crew on board before sinking their ship. Nonetheless, the damage done to Allied merchant shipping was considered great enough for a task force to be assembled, which was ordered to find and destroy the Graf Spee. That she would strike at the River Plate was a hunch on the part of the force commander, Commodore Henry Harwood, but he was proven right. Langsdorff suspected that the 3 British ships in the area were protecting a large merchant convoy, and that is what persuaded him to attack. At 18 minutes past 6 on the morning of December the 13th, the Graf Spee opened fire with her deadly accurate 11-inch guns and severely damaged the Exeter. although the British ship was able to return fire, wrecking the German ship's fuel system. However, the combined fire from Ajax and Achilles forced Graf Spee to break off action and head away under a smokescreen, but not without first landing shells on HMS Ajax. With the British ships in hot pursuit, the Graf Spee headed for the River Plate, but she was still a dangerous beast. Even at a distance of some 15 miles, she was a whisker from hitting the Achilles, close enough to make her turn away hidden behind a smokescreen. The British ships continued to shadow Graf Spee for the remainder of the day, avoiding the shells that were still being fired by the German ship. The day's action saw 108 men killed on the ships on both sides. Very early on the morning of December the 14th, the Graf Spee dropped anchor in the harbour at Montevideo in neutral Uruguay. This was a mistake. Uruguay, while neutral, favoured the Allies, and Montevideo was home to British diplomats who tried to force the Graf Spee to leave port under Articles 14 and 16 of the Hague Convention. There were long negotiations, and while the political wrangling was going on, information was fed to the German ship that suggested a large British fleet was waiting outside port for the Graf Spee to make her next move. Among those supposedly lying in wait for the Graf Spee were the HMS Ark Royal and HMS Renown. In fact, there was no such thing. The fleet comprised only the Ajax and Achilles plus HMS Cumberland, which had been summoned from a refit in the Falkland Islands. But the Germans were completely taken in. A terrible dilemma now faced Captain Langsdorff. The Graf Spee had very little ammunition remaining and a badly damaged fuel system. There was certainly not enough ammunition or fuel on board to allow her to get back to Germany. The German captain was an honourable man who saw no sense in shedding more blood in futile fighting, and so he chose to scuttle the Admiral Graf Spee in the River Plate estuary on December the 17th.
Then flaming finale. The suicide ship, blown up by her own captain, surrenders to the sea. Ablaze from bow to stern, the Admiral Graf Spee is scuttled, rather than run the gauntlet of waiting British cruisers.
In Berlin, Hitler was furious when he heard the news. The loss of the Graf Spee was a major embarrassment to Nazi Germany, despite the German propaganda machine swinging into action to explain it away. It gave the British and the Allies a major boost as the Phoney War dragged on, and it confirmed the fighting reputation of the British fleet. It also did no harm to the reputation of the First Lord of the Admiralty either. He was a certain Winston Churchill.
That challenged the might of the British Navy and failed.
The first signs that the Phoney War was really coming to an end and that events were gathering pace came in the spring of 1940. For very different reasons, both sides had their eyes on neutral Norway. The Germans were determined to secure access to the Norwegian ports through which vital Swedish iron ore was shipped. By achieving this, vital war production would not be disrupted by the British naval blockade. Also, to win control of the Norwegian airfield was important for the Germans. From these, their reconnaissance aircraft would be able to operate far out over the Atlantic Ocean. For Britain and France, Norway provided a tempting place to strike at the enemy while still keeping the war at a distance. Neither side wanted a repeat of the horrors of the trench warfare that came to epitomize the Great War. Winston Churchill was the leading advocate of an invasion of Norway, his main aim being to seize control of the strategically vital port of Narvik in the north of the country. In February 1940, the tension in the area was turned up a notch because of the Altmark incident, during which the German tanker Altmark, with 300 British prisoners of war on board, was attacked by HMS Cossack while she was sheltering in a Norwegian fjord. It was a clear violation of Norwegian neutrality and of international law by the British, and for the Germans it was proof positive of British intent. Hitler was said to be very angry indeed when he received news of what had happened to the Altmark, and it hardened his resolve to act in Norway. While German plans for invasion were stepped up, Churchill's plan to mine Norwegian waters, which was strongly supported by the new French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, was accepted at an Allied meeting in London. The strategy was for the mines to force German ships away from the Norwegian ports and out into international waters where they could be attacked by the British Navy, and then to land troops at ports such as Trondheim and Bergen. But the German plans were far more advanced. They intended to capture the major Norwegian cities, including Oslo, and attack the Norwegian airfields. Trondheim, Bergen and Narvik were to be attacked by troops in amphibious landings. The main German invasion force set sail for Norway on April the 6th. 2 days later, the Allies began to lay their mines as planned, and British and French troops prepared to go into action. On April the 9th, the Germans made simultaneous landings at Oslo, Bergen, Kristiansund, Trondheim and Narvik. The Luftwaffe quickly took control of most of the Norwegian airfields, with German troops being ferried in by the thousand via the Luftwaffe's transport fleet. This was the world's first offensive airborne operation. What was more, these were also the first amphibious landings of the war, and they were being carried out right under the nose of the powerful British Navy. Oslo was occupied almost unopposed. By April the 16th, the Germans had won control of much of southern Norway. But the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, suffered badly as it tried to return home after the amphibious landings. The British Navy tore into it. 9 German destroyers, 3 cruisers, 4 U-boats and 4 other ships were sent to the bottom of the sea. These were losses that the German Navy could ill afford. But the British successes at sea were not matched by those on land. Compared to the smooth German operation, the Allied campaign was confused to say the least. It was an inglorious story of muddled objectives, wrong or missing equipment, and lack of artillery or aircraft support for the Allied troops. Some units weren't even issued with local maps. The operation had been thrown together in haste, and unfortunately for the Allied troops, it showed. Only at Narvik in the north was there some Allied success. The German ships in port there took a terrible pounding. But even here, the opportunity created was not followed up by any Allied amphibious landing. It wasn't until May the 28th that the port was finally captured, and by then it was a case of too little, too late. Elsewhere, the Luftwaffe, in control of the airfields and in control of the skies, continued to make their deadly raids on the Norwegian towns and the British ships. Hundreds of British troops were captured and made prisoners of war by the Germans, and the Allied offensive in central Norway simply ground to a halt. And so there was little else for it but to withdraw from Norway, which the Allies did in June 1940. Germany had won a great victory at relatively little cost. Only at sea had losses been high, and there's no doubt that these were to have quite an effect on the German Navy as the war progressed. But for now, there was no denying that Hitler had got what he wanted, and the German occupation of Norway was to be a major problem for the Allies in the months and years ahead. Hitler's Norwegian campaign had also claimed a big political scalp in Britain. Someone had to pay the price for the fiasco, and the buck stopped with the man at the very top, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. The stinging criticism from within his own party was one thing, but it was clear that the public had also lost confidence in him. It was an impossible situation for Chamberlain, and so he resigned on May the 10th, 1940. The man chosen to replace him was Winston Churchill.
At the critical moment and out of crisis, Britain gets the war Prime Minister of her desire. Behind Mr. Churchill, the country rallies solidly and resolutely to the task of defeating the most sinister madman that ever aspired to world conquest. The man to beat Hitler is Winston Churchill. Among his colleagues, Mr. Chamberlain, whose vacation of office was accomplished in a manner worthy of his great sincerity, remains as Churchill's right hand. He has still a strong hold on the public, as was shown when he left Downing Street to hand in his resignation.
Churchill had previously been rather unpopular in Westminster and indeed in the country by his endless warning of the power of Hitler's Third Reich, and especially of the Luftwaffe. Now he took over, and thank heavens he was the one man on earth who could lead Britain to victory in World War II.
On the very same day that Chamberlain tendered his resignation, German forces began their Western offensive, one that is widely acknowledged as one of the most devastating and successful campaigns in modern military history. Although the opposing forces ranged against each other were roughly equal, at the head of the Wehrmacht's extraordinary strike into the heartlands of Western Europe were the panzer tank groups of General Guderian. 10 powerful divisions made up of more than 300 vehicles each, and all in the hands of men now expert in the terrifying tactic of blitzkrieg. The Allies had nothing to match them.
Germany let go what became known as the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and this was a previously unknown combination of overwhelming air power and overwhelming force on land, especially with tanks and armoured cars.
At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of May the 10th, 1940, the German army struck into Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe's airstrikes were deadly, and the panzer divisions advanced at lightning speed. There was little the Dutch or Belgian armies could do to resist. The major Belgian fort of Ebenemael, then supposed to be the most modern fortress in the world, fell to German troops on that very first day. In response, 40 divisions of the best French and British troops, including the entire BEF, poured into Belgium to help shore up the defensive line there. It was a trap, and just what the Germans had intended them to do, because it was to the south, in the barely defended Ardennes forest, that they intended to land their knockout blow. Because the Ardennes was thought by the French to be impenetrable by tanks, they had left their poorest divisions here, and the Germans knew it. Starting out on May the 10th, 7 panzer divisions crashed through the thick Ardennes woodland, and by the 12th, they had reached the strategically vital French River Meuse defences at Sedan. The Luftwaffe and the Panzers bombarded the French positions mercilessly, and soon the French gunners were in full retreat. The Germans crossed the River Meuse soon afterwards. It had taken them just 4 days. The easy German victory at Sedan was a heavy blow to French morale.
The Germans, by a remarkable combination of air bombing and heavily armored tanks, have broken through the French defenses north of the Maginot Line, and strong columns of their armored vehicles are ravaging the open country, which for the first day or two was without defenders. They have penetrated deeply and spread alarm and confusion in their track. Behind them there are now appearing infantry in lorries, and behind them again the large masses are moving forward. The regroupment of the French armies to make head against and also to strike at this intruding wedge has been proceeding for several days, largely assisted by the magnificent efforts of the Royal Air Force.
On May the 14th, there was more bad news. Holland surrendered to the Germans. On the very same day, Allied aircraft tried to hit back at the German positions by blowing up the pontoon bridges that had been built over the Meuse, but with disastrous consequences. The losses suffered by the air crews were appalling. Nearly half of the attacking aircraft were shot from the skies. With the bridgehead at Sedan secured, now came the second crucial phase of the German strategy, the manoeuvre that would see the French and British armies trapped in Belgium. It was called the Sickle Cut by General von Manstein, who devised the plan. By turning the German forces to the north towards the French coast, the aim was to surround and cut off the main Allied army. There was now a dash for the coast, an echo of the race for the sea in the early weeks of the First World War. Except this time the Germans won the race easily, capturing many thousands of dispirited French troops as they did so. To compound the tragedy for France, the roads in the north of the country soon became choked with the pitiful sight of desperate refugees, all fleeing the German onslaught, almost all with absolutely nowhere to go. On May the 17th, the Belgian capital, Brussels, fell. Meanwhile, in France, Guderian's 19th Corps drove on relentlessly forward towards the coast. They reached Abbeville on May the 20th. Within a week, Boulogne and Calais had also fallen into German hands. Now all eyes were on Dunkirk, the seaport to where the BEF and the French army had been forced to retreat. Dunkirk was the scene of one of the most extraordinary episodes of the entire war. Chased towards the seaside town by the German tank divisions, the British and French troops made a valiant fighting retreat of some 30 miles between May the 25th and May the 28th, until the vast majority were dug in on the beaches. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, the decision to evacuate the troops had actually been taken on May the 25th, and the first ship sailed across the English Channel the following day. The rescue of the Allied army was in the hands of a hastily gathered flotilla of British, Dutch, Belgian and French craft, made up of 40 destroyers and a host of minesweepers and patrol ships, But what made the evacuation all the more remarkable were the hundreds of privately owned volunteer craft, forever remembered as the little ships, which joined Operation Dynamo and sailed across the channel to help get the troops off the beaches. There were pleasure boats, fishing boats, all manner of craft and their crews, which made themselves available in a desperate hour of need. In all, more than 900 ships set sail in a last-ditch attempt to avert a complete disaster for the Allied armies. It was heroic but dangerous work, as these Dunkirk veterans remember.
We were strafed from stem to stern with machine gun fire from an ME-109, I expect it was. All the while, the troops were still walking out to the boats. Some even walked with the rifles above their heads. It was quite organised. And even when the destroyers left, we had no air cover. And you could see the soldiers on the beach laying on their backs and firing at the aircraft as they came in, dive bombing and machine gunning.
Certainly we were clear of the land, but unfortunately, almost as soon as the sun rose, a German aircraft, which I remember as a Dornier 217, came round, saw us, spotted us, turned around and came back and just sank us with gunfire. And of those on board, 6 of us were good swimmers and got back to the beach. And 2 of us survived the reception committee and went further north again.
It was a feeling of intense relief when this officer picked us up, because up until then, you know, we were strictly on our own. And he took us to the destroyer, and then, you know, it was a feeling of enormous relief when we got on the destroyer. And the sailors were just terrific. They just shoved the hats on the back of their heads and said, well, don't worry, fellas, I'll get you a cup of tea. And the bombs are falling all around us. You know, we really felt that we were back among friends then. But up until then, we were very much alone.
I expect I'll relive it. It's an opportunity that I'm glad I was able to take, and I wouldn't have missed for the world.
This man, Lord Cameron, later to become a distinguished judge, was in command of the very last ship to leave the Dunkirk beaches.
Very last white ensign craft to leave. So that's one thing I can claim, if nothing else. But it was a marvellous operation altogether, and a deliverance.
Quite apart from the German army battering away at the gates of Dunkirk, the troops that were trapped among the dunes had to contend with the circling planes of the Luftwaffe. Had it not been for the pilots and planes of the RAF's fighter command, there's little doubt that they would have caused a massacre at Dunkirk on an almost unimaginable scale. But the British planes flew time and again to fight the Stuka dive bombers and deny the Germans complete mastery of the skies. However, the RAF paid a fearful price for its heroism. Well over 100 planes were lost and 60 pilots killed during the fighting. In fact, the RAF lost more than half its operational strength during the battle for France. These were crippling losses at a time when Britain could least afford them.
At that time, the RAF was divided between the Home Air Force and the Advanced Air Striking Force and British Expeditionary Force in France. The fighting in France and Belgium and Holland was so catastrophic to the RAF that at the end of May and in early June, we had lost 944 aircraft, including 356 Hurricanes and 67 Spitfires. Lord Dowding desperately asked Prime Minister Churchill, please don't send any more squadrons to France. I need them to defend Britain.
Despite the valiant efforts of the RAF fighters, they couldn't prevent the destruction of 6 Navy destroyers and more than 200 smaller craft during the Dunkirk evacuations. While British Army units such as the 51st Highland Division fought at Dunkirk's defensive perimeter to keep the Germans from overrunning them, the evacuation continued. By June the 4th, almost 340,000 troops, including nearly 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers, had been rescued from the beaches. They left behind them 30,000 dead or wounded comrades. A further 34,000 were made prisoner of war when Dunkirk finally fell. In truth, the escape of the Allied armies was little short of miraculous. The Dunkirk spirit certainly provided the public with a much-needed boost to flagging morale. Not surprisingly, the cinema newsreels of the day made much of it, painting Dunkirk as some kind of victory. But in truth, the victory, if any, was that while Britain had been defeated, it had avoided a complete disaster.
Smoke from the fires of Dunkirk almost obscured the sun. But in this inferno, while the BEF and their French comrades held off the Nazis in an epic rearguard action, it was here that the yachts, motorboats and Saucy Janes performed magnificent feats of rescue. Many were lost, sunk or blown to bits or burnt, but the gallant armada carried out the task assigned to it. In vessels of all sizes and descriptions, 1/3 men, including the wounded, were embarked and brought home under the protection of the Royal Navy.
While the bulk of Britain's weary troops had returned home to fight another day, the cost in materials of the defeat was staggering. 76,000 tons of ammunition and 600,000 tons of fuel were left behind, as well as 60,000 trucks. 1,200 field guns fell into German hands, as well as roughly the same number of anti-aircraft guns. It was months before Britain could make good these losses.
Britain had almost no defences except Fighter Command and the Royal Navy. The Army was a shattered remnant which had lost most of its armour in France, and indeed even its small arms.
It later emerged that while the fighting was raging and the might of the German army was bearing down on Dunkirk, Adolf Hitler had issued a last-minute order to his generals to hold back the panzer divisions. By doing this, he not only gave the Allies an unexpected reprieve, but provided the war with some of its more intriguing questions. Why did Hitler hold back? Some say it was because he wanted to give Hermann Göring the honour of finishing off the Allies with his Luftwaffe dive bombers. Others that he wanted to preserve his tank divisions for the coming campaign against the capital Paris. Another theory is that by holding back, Hitler was encouraging Britain to come to a negotiated peace in order to save his armies the trouble of invading. No one will ever really know the answer, but there can surely be little doubt about one thing, that if Hitler had let loose his tanks on the Allied troops at Dunkirk, then flotilla or not, evacuating the army from the beaches would have been almost impossible, and the outcome of the battle would have been very different. On May the 28th, while the Dunkirk evacuation was taking place, came another blow to the Allies. Belgium surrendered unconditionally to the Germans. The day after Dunkirk was captured, Hitler sent his all-powerful Panzer Division south to win the greatest prize, Paris. Within 4 days, they had driven through the dispirited remnants of the French army and had arrived at the banks of the Seine. On June the 14th, the city fell to the Wehrmacht. France, beaten and battered into submission, surrendered on June the 22nd. It seemed that Hitler's war was virtually won. With Italy now in the war on the German side, only Britain now stood between the Third Reich and total victory. In one of his most famous and stirring speeches, Winston Churchill tried to rally his countrymen and urge them to their duty. His famous words were both true and prophetic. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.